Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. After the 2021 Russian Grand Prix, on Twitter there was so much conversation going on. Lando losing his probable first win of his career, Lewis making it 100, the first driver to ever win 100 races, everyone else who won and lost out in the rain at the end of the race. There was so much to talk about. But once the dust had kind of settled down a bit on things, there was another pretty common sentiment that I saw popping up a lot, which is that Carlos Sainz is so underrated. Yes, I did film this video prior to the Turkish Grand Prix where Carlos Sainz would only go and prove the point of the title. One driver of the day, the first time since its introduction in 2016 that he's won a driver of the day. First time. But yeah, just so you know, all of the numbers stated are true up to 15 races into this year, which was after the Russian Grand Prix before Turkey. I mean, the man had just finished P3, his third podium of the season at Ferrari, his new team. He's making his debut season at Ferrari. He qualified P2, he jumped Lando at the start of the race. He was leading for a good chunk of it, and then his tyre graining at the front meant Lando got back past him. He pitted on lap 48, which was pretty much spot on the right time. Bottas and Raikkonen pitted on 47, but then Verstappen pitted on 48 as well when he jumped up massively too. But all in all, the Russian Grand Prix weekend was pretty nailed on for Carlos. It was pretty spot on. Then you look at the broader season, he's still ahead of Charles Leclerc in the driver's standings, 112.5 points versus Charles's 104. And we know Charles is quite rightly rated very, very highly. He slapped up Marcus Ericsson in his first season in Formula One, went into the Ferrari, almost won at Bahrain in his first year, his second race. Carlos also beat Lando in both seasons they raced together at McLaren points-wise. And we know from this year how good Lando is. Carlos Sainz is absolutely quality. That is very much my belief right now in Formula One. But I want to look back through his F1 career and try and understand where this underrated perception comes from, whether I think it's true or not, because the 27-year-old is now in his 7th year in the sport, so we've got plenty of results to look back at. Is Carlos Sainz actually underrated? August 2018 was over 3 years ago now. And I mean, this Tommo F1 YouTube channel wasn't even a thing in my mind at the time. But you know what was on my mind at the time? Today's video sponsor, Squarespace. That is the month that I set up my very own Squarespace website, tommccluskey.co.uk, which has primarily functioned as my portfolio when I used to be working agency work before this YouTube thing kicked off. And it also hosted as a little shop when I sold my 50k subscriber pins and my 100k subscriber posters. Squarespace has got your back, and genuinely, with 3 years use, I couldn't recommend them more highly. If you are interested, head to squarespace.com and have a butcher's. And the best thing is you can try it out completely free. You can take your time, you can play around with the user interface and just have some fun with it. It's only when you want to put your website live to the entire world that you have to pay anything, and that's the time that you should be using the discount code TOMMOF1 or giving the link in the top line of the description a tap for 10% off your first website or domain. So let's start this video by just clearing up, so we're all reading from the same hymn sheet, what underrated actually stands for, because we need to be going from the same collective definition, right? So the Cambridge English Dictionary definition of underrated is better or more important than most people believe. So to rephrase, is Carlos Sainz underrated? Is Carlos Sainz better than most people believe? Now the tricky thing obviously is the most people part, because of course nobody knows what every single Formula One fan thinks and believes about every single driver. That perception of most people comes from your immediate social circle and the media that you choose to consume. They're the kind of two main factors as far as I'm concerned, and there's so many variables, there's infinite variables. And that is why this debate will always be so polarized. My idea of most people is going to be very different to your idea of most people. And that's fine, and you just have to take this conversation with a pinch of salt. So now we've got that cleared up, let's delve into those 7 years of Carlos Sainz in Formula One, starting in 2015. 2015, that is so long ago. That's when I graduated from bloody university. Jesus Christ. So Carlos Sainz Jr. made his rookie F1 appearance at Toro Rosso at the age of 20 in 2015, alongside 17-year-old Max Verstappen. Sainz beat Verstappen in qualifying 10-9. But in the races, points-wise, Max very much came out on top. 49 points to Carlos Sainz's 18. 2 P4s for Max being the highlights, 1 P7 for Carlos being his best result. Max out here killing careers since he was 17. He is so good. Like, you just can't deny it. He just is. When you start your rookie season alongside another rookie and they're 3 years younger than you and they quite convincingly beat you points-wise, it's not a great start, is it? It's not a great look. But Carlos was super unlucky to draw Max as his first teammate because, again, Max is different gravy. 2016 would see Carlos Sainz retain his seat alongside Max Verstappen, but only for the first 4 races of the year. Then Max and Daniel Kvyat swapped. Of those first 4 races though, Max would win qualifying 3-1 against Carlos and points 13-4. When Kvyat took that seat alongside Carlos though, Sainz had a much better time of it. Carlos out-qualified Kvyat 11-5 and points-wise 42 points to 4 for Kvyat. Carlos managed 3 P6s in Spain, USA and Brazil, which all contributed to an absolute annihilation of the torpedo. Sorry, Daniel. Verstappen won his first race in that Red Bull. Obviously, Verstappen was hogging all of the Red Bull young driver limelight. Ultimately, for Carlos, that meant he kind of sat in the shadows. I completely forgot he did such a good job against Daniel Kvyat when they first drove together. Now on to 2017, a season where 4 drivers drove in that Toro Rosso. It's unusual enough to get 1 mid-season driver swap, let alone 2. But then again, the whole point of that Toro Rosso team, it was built as a proving ground for young talent. So I don't begrudge Red Bull for mixing the drivers around, to be honest. Kvyat, Gasly, Hartley, and of course Carlos Sainz. Carlos would race 17 races for Toro Rosso before moving to Renault just before the end of the season. When you consider how well Verstappen was doing at Red Bull, Ricciardo was also doing a great job, you can understand why maybe Sainz didn't see the opportunity at the main team. I think that's fair enough. So head-to-head teammate battle time, Sainz and Kvyat were together for the first 14 races of the year. 8-6 in quali to Sainz and 48-4 to Sainz in points. Again, Kvyat got mullered. And again, Carlos moved to Renault for the final 4 races of the season alongside Nico Hülkenberg. In quali, it was 3-1 to Nico and points-wise 9-6. All of Carlos's 6 points came in his debut race at Renault in the USA with a P7 finish. Now 2018, his one and only full season at Renault alongside Nico Hülkenberg. How did he do? Because this was a good challenge for Carlos going into his 4th year in the sport alongside Hülkenberg, who's going into his 8th. Qualifying head-to-head was 13-8 to Nico, although the gap averaged at 0.101 seconds, so pretty marginal, very, very close. Points-wise, it was 69-53 in favour of Hülkenberg once again. Nico managed 5 P6s and 1 P5 over the course of the year. Carlos also got a P5, but again, just tended to average 1, maybe 2 places behind Nico over the course of the year. They were close, but Hülkenberg came out on top. Now, before we get into 2019, I think we should quickly just go over what we've looked at so far. So yes, he firmly beat Kvyat both seasons that they raced together, big dub, but also got beaten by Hülkenberg and pretty well beaten by Verstappen. Like, my honest feelings, I remember like at the end of the 2018 season when that move to McLaren for 2019 was announced, I was a bit like, Carlos Sainz, he's okay. He's nothing special. He's a good, solid F1 driver. Again, a bit of a Nico Hülkenberg maybe, but I don't see him as a top tier, top echelon F1 driver like Verstappen, like Leclerc, like Hamilton, like Vettel, who come previously. He never grabbed the headlines early on, partly because of Max taking those headlines away. But again, fair enough. Like, he was a much more impressive young driver coming in than Carlos Sainz, and also a lot younger. And that lack of spotlight definitely hindered his perception, at least in my mind at the time. But anyway, on to 2019. The move to McLaren was a bit of a domino one, wasn't it? Because obviously Alonso announced his retirement from F1 and McLaren at the end of 2018. So Sainz took his spot. Ricciardo moved from Red Bull and took Carlos Sainz's spot at Renault. And I do wonder that if Alonso hadn't retired, whether Carlos might have lost his seat altogether, because Renault were desperately keen to get Daniel Ricciardo in. They threw the checkbook at him. And I do wonder if they would have replaced Carlos or Nico in the end. Ultimately, they didn't need to make that decision because of Alonso's retirement, but you do wonder. Fortunately, that wasn't the case, and he was paired in 2019 with the very, very highly rated young McLaren rookie, Lando Norris. Head-to-head in qualifying, Lando took the dub 11-10 with the final race in Abu Dhabi, where he out-qualified Carlos. But points-wise, Carlos was well clear, 96 points to Lando's 49. Carlos did manage that P3 into Lagos towards the end of the year, but also his consistency throughout the season in terms of higher point scoring finishes was a lot better than Lando's. 3 P5s and 4 P6s really helped the cause. The best Lando could do was 2 P6s all season. Granted, Norris was struck down by some rotten luck at times. Spa, it's broken. Prime example. But at the end of the day, Norris only retired once more than Carlos all season. Carlos did the job against his rookie teammate. He needed to do the job, but also he lost that in qualifying, which would have hurt Carlos's ego quite a bit. And then on to 2020, their final season as teammates. It was a lot closer. Quali head-to-head, in actual comparable circumstances, it was 8-5 to Carlos, with the average gap just 0.044 seconds. Very close. Very marginal. And then on to points, Carlos Sainz came out on top once again. 105 points to Lando's 97. So there's only 8 points between them by the end of the year. Honestly, for me, performance-wise, in 2020, I don't think anything split them. I think they were the closest driver pairing of any driver pairing in Formula One. Maybe Sainz's experience gave him the slight edge. So he got his P2 at Monza, where he was chasing down Gasly at the end. But also Lando got his P3 in Austria, covering that 5-second penalty that Lewis got for taking out. Carlos finished 6th in the driver's title, Lando 9th, but their consistency meant that McLaren finished 3rd in the constructors, ahead of Racing Point. Back when the car wasn't green, it was pink, and it was actually pretty good. And then, of course, 2021, Carlos is representing the Scuderia alongside Charles Leclerc. He got that dream move, which I don't think any other seat would have tempted Carlos away from McLaren, because him and Lando were onto a really good thing at McLaren, and we'll talk about what if he stayed in a bit. But the pull of Ferrari, I mean, that's going to pull most drivers in, isn't it? Now, this year, I've been keeping track myself of the qualifying head-to-heads. None of this sprint qualifying nonsense. It's not qualifying. Q1, Q2, Q3, that is qualifying. And their head-to-head, Charles has a solid lead, 10-5 over Carlos. But again, given this is Charles's 3rd year in the Ferrari, this is Carlos's 1st, I'd say that's pretty fair. Again, points-wise, Carlos is ahead, 112.5 to 108. And Ferrari is the highest placed team in the constructors to have a new driver for this year outscoring the previous driver. I will say Charles has had a lot of bad luck this year. He's made some mistakes, but he's had a lot of rotten luck as well. In terms of actual performances, I do think Charles has done a better job. But when you consider this is Carlos's 1st year in that team, so much to get used to, so much to get on top of, he's done stupidly well. Ridiculous. Sainz has been there to pick up the pieces when fortuity has dealt him a good hand, of course, but he's also been up there on merit again. Russia, prime example. To have scored 3 podiums already alongside a driver of the calibre of Charles in probably the 4th best car of the year, sometimes 3rd. The attention and the respect that Carlos Sainz is receiving this year is definitely more than I've ever seen it in previous years. And I guess that is why this whole he's underrated comment is coming up so much, because he's objectively smashing it right now. But that's where we are today. Now, before we move on, I do want to, and I alluded to this earlier, talk about what if Carlos didn't leave McLaren? Because, of course, him and Charles have gone pretty close this year, but for most of the grid, you've got a very firm 1st and 2nd driver, right? Including at McLaren, where he just left. Yes, Daniel got his win at Monza, But let's not get it twisted. Lando has been slapping him up this year. It's just true. I love you, Daniel. I know it will get better, but right now, Lando's very much on top. If Carlos had stayed and you've got two drivers scoring at the level of Lando, could they be challenging for the Constructors' title? That might sound a bit mad, but Bottas has had a bit of a poor year. Perez has had a poor year relative to his expectations. I get why, but those teams are the top two teams and they don't have two drivers each firing from the barrel, right? And especially when you consider Sainz outscored Norris in 19 and 20, I think it's a question worth asking. And yes, 68.4% of you thought I was chatting a load of nonsense in just asking this question, and I get that completely. But 31.6% of you thought that they could be challenging a constructor. Now, again, on the face of this question, I was just like, they'd be a bit closer, but I don't think they'd be challenging. But then I thought, let's try and work it out. There's no doubt in my mind they'd be in a stronger constructor's position, but how much stronger, and would they be close to the top two teams? So I'll come up with this system. I just came up with this on my own back. I never asked or consulted anyone on this, so it might be a load of nonsense, right? But I've come up with 3 rules that I'm going to apply here to try and establish how many more points McLaren would have if Carlos Sainz was in that seat. Rule number 1 is that Carlos Sainz keeps all of Daniel Ricciardo's results when he beat Lando. So P1 at Monza, for example, Carlos Sainz will get that P1 now. Lando Norris will keep the P2. Lando's results don't change in this, by the way. They stay exactly the same. Rule number 2 is that Carlos Sainz keeps his Ferrari results where he finished ahead of both Norris and Ricciardo. So, for example, his P2 at Monza where Norris finished P3 and Ricciardo finished in the car park somewhere. It wasn't a good day for Daniel. And the third and final rule, if any result doesn't meet these 2 conditions, then Carlos Sainz will by default finish 1 position behind Lando in every single race. So for example, Bahrain, first race of the year, Lando finished P4, Daniel finished P7. So in this instance, Carlos will finish P5. And bear in mind, when Carlos moves up positions, that also means sometimes the Mercedes and Red Bull drivers will sometimes lose positions. I'm only looking at the McLaren, Red Bull and Mercedes drivers as well, because I think we can all agree that if Carlos Sainz was in that seat, most likely they'd be clear of Ferrari. They're ahead of Ferrari anyway, but you look at how, again, wobbly Daniel's results have been, yet how consistent Carlos was in that McLaren, I've got no doubt. So looking at the numbers, you can see that Mercedes and Red Bull have lost a few points, but nothing major. They're pretty much where they were. However, the gap between Red Bull and McLaren has closed up significantly from 130.5 points, what it is at the moment, down to just 41.5 points. Now, does that constitute as a challenge? I'll leave that up to you to decide. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely appreciate these are some pretty wild assumptions that I'm making. I mean, Daniel scored 95 points this season. I'm suggesting that Carlos, by this stage, would have scored 169 points, which is 30 more than Lando. But again, based on the previous 2 seasons, is the idea of Sainz outscoring Norris that wild? I'd say it isn't. Look, just take this graph for what you will. It's just a bit of fun at the end of the day. It's not that deep. So now we've looked at all 7 of Carlos Sainz's seasons in Formula 1. Do we have a better idea of where this underrated perception stems from? I think we do. Like I've already mentioned, he didn't hit the ground running in his early junior career, especially, again, 3 years younger teammate Max Verstappen outperforming him at such an early stage. You look at how Vettel came onto the scene, how Hamilton came onto the scene, how Michael Schumacher came onto the scene. So many of these iconic drivers straight away were super impressive. Carlos Sainz didn't have that, and I think however good Carlos goes on to become, you know, he's still only 27. That will always be, even unconsciously, held against him. Then we look at the time at McLaren, again, rookie season, out-qualified by your rookie teammate. And also, yes, he got a lot more points than Lando, but it wasn't a demolition job in terms of performances. Like, I remember that season well. It wasn't like Lando was getting handed it every weekend by Carlos. Like, he was unlucky. Carlos did the better job, granted, but because he didn't destroy him, again, we look at how Gasly's destroying Tsunoda, how Verstappen destroyed Albon and Gasly. Like, we're not seeing that level of demolition job from Carlos Sainz here. Carlos Sainz's teammates were always pretty unknown entities. Again, he did a great job against Kvyat, but Kvyat's confidence was in the mud. He'd just been dropped from Red Bull. He'd done a really good job alongside Daniel Ricciardo in that first year they had together as Red Bull teammates. He outscored him over the course of the year. In terms of established known entity teammates, he only really had Nico Hülkenberg after that and got beaten by him. I think another factor is his age. Again, he's 27, which, don't get me wrong, like, I'm still a year and a half older than Carlos Sainz. But again, you look at all these drivers in their early 20s, they're the ones with all the hype and the excitement because they're so young and they got opportunities so early. Because that leads on to another point, and I think it is kind of media bias. I'm not talking about British bias. That can come in another video. When you consider he's been teammates with Verstappen, Norris, and Leclerc, these are all incredibly exciting young drivers. These are drivers that are generally perceived as being future world title challengers. Whenever he's been alongside those drivers, they have hogged the spotlight. You know, Verstappen was the 17-year-old Red Bull prodigy, son of Jos, did a fantastic job, beat Carlos fair and square. But then Norris was the young McLaren prodigy British driver at a British team looking to rise from the ashes, doing a really, really good job relative to Carlos, on Twitch, personable. I've spoke to the lad before, lovely bloke. And it's just like, from that media coverage and fan perception, it was always a losing battle for Carlos against Lando. And then Charles Leclerc, again, he's got a Ferrari contract to about 2089. And, he is their future. He's their next Schumacher, I think. That's the perception I'm feeding. And Carlos Sainz has come alongside and he's older than Charles. Yes, he's outscoring him at the minute this season. But I still think, this is the driver that displaced one of Ferrari's most successful drivers of all time, 4-time world title winner Sebastian Vettel, got his elbows out, and Seb ended up leaving. Or was he pushed? We'll never know. Zero shade on Max, Lando and Charles, by the way. I'm just acknowledging what clearly exists and why, again, when people perceive Carlos as being underrated, it's because he's not getting the attention that these other drivers get because they're more exciting from a commercial point of view. They generate more clicks because they've got bigger fan bases. And these factors clearly have an effect on how a driver is perceived. So do I think Carlos Sainz is underrated? Yes, I do. I think that because of all the attention these other drivers get, I think Carlos is often a bit forgotten about in the media. He's not the only driver that goes under the radar when he has a good performance, for sure, but because he doesn't, again, captivate the spotlight, the excitement, the fandom of a lot of other drivers, he does go unnoticed. But he's proven this year how good he is. Look, Lando said it himself. He was interviewed in June by Sky Sports and talking about his relationship with Carlos in 2020. Not many people knew how good Carlos is. And I think this year, Carlos has proven how good he is against Charles, who everyone rates as one of the best drivers in Formula One. Vamos, Carlos. I know his win is coming. I can feel it. I've got to be honest. I love Lando Norris and I'm so confident that Lando is going to pick up wins in his career. But if Carlos Sainz had won in Russia, I wouldn't have been mad at all. I would have been so happy for him. But there we go. That's my bit on why Carlos Sainz is underrated, why I agree that he is underrated, and why you should start rating Carlos Sainz a bit more highly. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Maybe I'm talking a load of nonsense. Let me know. I'm sure you will. I don't need to tell you to tell me when you think I'm wrong, because you do anyway. And that's why I love you lot. We have an honest relationship. This is what I want from my YouTube channel. But yes, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace have been absolute legends to me over this last year, and that relationship isn't stopping anytime soon. So thank you to Squarespace. My name's been Tommo, as it typically is. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.